Hello, and welcome to our latest episode of the Digital Access Show. So, in the last month or last week, really, we've been looking at what good, usable digital communication is. Last week, I chatted to Jackie McRae from CopyCred, and she was talking about the content, the writing of it, how to make the content understandable, readable, and looking at all those parts of the web content accessibility guidelines. This week, we're going to actually look at the whole of the web content accessibility guidelines. We're actually going to look at another principle associated with good usable digital communication, and that's accessibility. So to do that, I've actually asked CEO of DASAT to come on, Mark Muscat. Thanks, Mark, for coming on.
Thanks, Nora.
Mark, you and I both have been doing a fair few audits in the last 12 months, 2 years, actually. It's quite a while. And with your work in teaching people how to use assistive technologies, the vision impaired in particular, to be able to access the information on the web, and with what you've seen with the work you're doing through Job Access, I would love to really talk about what are the common faults that you're finding and that I'm finding in digital accessibility? What's easily remedied, fixed, resolved?
Sure.
Yeah.
Where do you want to start?
Well, can you, for a start, when you're training someone
Nick said,
with
in South
digital
Australian now.
accessibility, what do you tell them? When you're training someone to use an iPhone or an Android or a computer, using screen readers, what's the first thing you say? Do you say, yeah, look, every website's accessible? What's your message that you tell them?
Well, it's like going to a person's house or a workplace or a building. It's going to be different. So it's about navigating and how to use the tools that assistive technologies provide us to allow us to navigate and actually successfully negotiate the tasks that we want to do with certain websites or apps. And no, I don't say every app or site is accessible. I like to think that that people will learn how to actually do some problem solving themselves to actually get around and be able to navigate the app or the website that they're trying to negotiate or use for whatever tasks. Could be shopping, booking tickets, etc. So yeah, it's about that. Some websites are just downright inaccessible, and when it gets to a stage where you have to use somebody with some sight to help you, that can be problematic. And let's hope that yeah, that we see fewer of those in the future. But there are still sites that do result in that happening.
Yeah. What about with the job access side of it, Mark? Because you're actually going in and working with businesses and with people with vision impairment to get them to be able to navigate the sites and the tools that are used at that workplace.
So let's just go back a little. So job access is actually government funding that allows people in Australia to maintain their work through workplace modification funding. It allows them to have workplace assessments conducted that will identify any barriers or issues. And a lot of that is related to digital access for vision impaired people, but there's also physical aspects for some people. And those assessments will have recommendations. To come back to your question, yeah, there is a great deal of websites, especially for workplaces, that are somewhat difficult to use as a visually impaired person, mainly because they're not exactly public websites. They're not like websites that you would go to if you're using Google or Facebook or the ABC here in Australia or any news outlet. they're public websites, so they've got to be somewhat accessible. So that's why people in those organisations make sure that their accessibility is actually up to date. There's quite a bit of testing, a lot of feedback gets acted on, which is great. But when you're working in a workplace, sometimes you're using websites, especially for databases, call center type phone systems. The Sometimes people will actually use mail systems that actually still involve using web-based applications, um, and sometimes they're not as accessible as you would like, and that's where some of the issues get identified. So
Mhm.
yeah, that becomes a digital access type issue, and sometimes uh, they can be assisted by some training. They can be overcome by providing some assistance to people how to navigate those websites. But other times, and this is where Job Access don't fund, sometimes it can be considered as a general accessibility issue, which is what they would determine as being reliant on the business actually to make that accessible. So um, if that's the case, then sometimes the businesses will need to make sure that they apply the accessibility guidelines that we'll talk about to those particular websites to make them
Okay,
work.
so let's get into it. So the first
Yeah.
principle in the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines is perceivability. And perceivability is all about all the elements on the website, the forms, the images, the color, the font size, everything that goes up to making it. What is the most common error that you see in perceivability?
Well, still the biggest problem that we still see, even though it's actually now very much prominent in getting people to put alternative text for the graphics, we still see a lot of people putting very interesting alternative texts. And sometimes it even involves uh, numbers and strings, which are not really anything that makes any sense to people. So yeah, we see a lot of bad alt texts even now, even though people know that they need to put that in. Um, I think sometimes the um, uh, the non-flowing aspects of formatting. So when I talk about that, I was just thinking like, yeah, you got headings that don't exactly look like they're structurally not flowing, aren't they? You're having a level three heading, um, you know, under in heading level one where you should have a heading level two, etc. There's just sort of that aesthetic look. Um, Contrast is a big one, isn't it? Still,
It's a massive
just something
one.
that you could probably talk to.
Yeah.
Um,
Contrast seems to be common for every website that I've actually audited in the last 6 months. There's always a contrast issue. And of course, for everyone, contrast between background and foreground should be 4.5 to 1 for text. If you're looking at an image or a control field, 3 to 1. But text, 4.5 to 1.
what Narelle's describing there is ratios that
Yeah.
can be identified through various contrast and accessibility tools that are available on the web, and they are
Yeah.
often providing a ratio between foreground and background, and
That's
that's
it.
a very useful tool to have. And what I was about to say to that is that when we talk about these principles and the guidelines, these guidelines have been thoroughly researched. So people just haven't pulled these ratios out of the hat. They've basically done they've had work groups that have conducted a large amount of academic research to find the ideal ratio for contrast, and they have obviously fed that back to the the WAI, which is the Web Accessibility Initiative, and they've in turn put it into the guidelines. But I don't say that just for contrast. Pretty much what I've been saying to a lot of people, uh, developers included, is that when you make something compliant to the WCAG, it's more than likely that you're going to be fitting into the majority of people with disabilities, because it's the people with disabilities that provide the feedback through various research um, programs that provide the information that gets uh, put into the guidelines. So
Mm,
that's something to take into consideration.
that's it.
I Other perceivable,
Let's go.
probably, yeah. Let's go into operability because I think
Yeah,
what I was about to say is operability.
let's do
Um,
operability. So for everyone, operability is how you access it. Do you access it by keyboard only? Can you only use a mouse? Is it braille, just braille keyboards only, or is it touch only? Everyone has different requirements. Operability is a big one.
it is, and it often relies on the ability to be able to develop your system so that you can allow for multiple devices to access the information that you're providing, um, whether that's actually through um, mouse or through touchpad or via keyboard control. It all comes down to providing access to the information for everyone. And so, yeah, I still see some big issues with keyboard. And that's probably understandable in the sense that most developers use a mouse to click on various controls. They sometimes should remember that maybe they need to, put the mouse to sleep and give it a go with the keyboard to give it a test. And for people like you and I, obviously we can't use a mouse, or most of us can, but we probably don't use a mouse as much as, say, a person with sight, because we use the keyboard to control the way our computers work, in and interacting with our screen readers. So we don't have the access sometimes that you would think you would have in some websites. So what's the problems that I see? Mm, Tab orders not being followed correctly. So when you press tab, it's not going from A to B. Sometimes it goes from A to C, then back to B. Um, Other aspects are that you go into a dialog box and you can't get out of it by pressing the escape key. I think that's one you and I have probably found the
Oh,
most.
yep.
And the
Even
menus,
menus,
yeah,
go for it.
menus are sometimes the big ones because you don't know whether you're inside a menu or outside the menu. And
Mm,
when you are inside the menu, pressing the escape key generally won't get you outside the menu, which is sometimes not a very good
yeah.
feeling because you get frustrated because you're not sure where you are. So things like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll throw one more in, skip to main content. So that is a piece of code that people don't see visually, but when you use a keyboard, you always hit it. And what it should do is, if the page is constructed properly, you've got your menu up in your heading, skip to main content will drop you down into the body of the website. So you don't have to go through the menu every time. It's a major one that is missing in a lot of websites.
And I think sometimes the big one for me, and it's not such a big problem anymore because I think some newer libraries are out and there's a
Mm.
lot more accessibility included. But sometimes in the older websites, especially where look at workplace type tools, when you press the button for menus, it's not telling us whether it's expanded or collapsed.
Mm.
So sometimes that can be a bit tricky as well for people, especially if they're trying to do their jobs day in, day out, and they're trying to find a certain menu item. And if they're not sure where they are, it sort of makes it a bit difficult. So yeah, but that, as I said, that's now improving, so it's a little bit better these days.
Yeah.
But yeah,
Well, let's look at understandability, and understandability is exactly that, that people can understand the web page, that the website does what you expect it to do every time, and that there's enough input assistance so you can input good data. So what are the errors that you find, Mark?
One of the biggest ones in understandability is the form. So when you're filling out a form and you're basically you've entered information and you go to the submit button, you find generally that you get some error message saying, please attend to the following items. And you're not sure what the items are because they're actually coloured and there's no textual reference or textual messages to say, okay, the date of birth or whatever is not correct. Um, and sometimes, it would be nice to have that sort of indication what's actually not filled in correctly.
Yeah, I've got
Um,
one for you. What about dates? You know, you go to enter a date, and like here in Australia, it's day slash month slash year. But sometimes you find it the opposite and you don't know, and you get an error and you think, well, I've entered the date, but because there's nothing to tell you how they want the date entered. And don't forget, date pickers are not always accessible. So if we can't access the date picker and there's no indication of the format of the date in the label or something that we can access, it's an issue.
mm,
And it's not just for people with no sight, it's all types of people struggle with that one.
yeah, I agree. I think that comes down to actually getting good instructions, and sometimes forms lack instructions. Yeah, there is sometimes where you'll get uh, little arrows that point to certain parts of forms, and yeah, that can be a bit misleading or difficult for anyone to follow.
Yeah,
Where if you have the arrows and some text on their labels, that's more beneficial, I think. Yeah, I was doing a survey which was a rather important one by the Queensland government, and I was not able to finish that survey, unfortunately, because certain radio buttons weren't, clearly grouped properly, and that's another big problem.
yep,
So, if a government is doing that in their surveys, it's not really fair on the people that they're meant to be representing because how could they say they've actually got good data from people if their survey collection tools
yeah,
that being their pages is not accessible?
that's it. I've got one last one for you in this area. What about abbreviations? You know, you find that abbreviation and you've got no idea what it means because it's never been expanded out in the page, or it might be on another page, but you haven't accessed that page. You've gone direct to the page that you want to look at.
I think if you're going to use acronyms, you should really have a glossary page.
Mm.
Um, that's what I tell people to do. So, I often think that you have you can have an acronym, for whatever and then you might have a link, and that link, so you could have ABC as a link, for instance. And if you
Mm.
hit enter on that, it takes you to a glossary page that explains what ABC means.
Yeah,
And that sometimes, I mean, I know it's a bit of work, but I think if you're using a lot of acronyms, it's probably useful. Otherwise, yeah, you could do exactly what you suggest, and that's expand it out for the first instance, and then refer to it. But that also requires that you would do that on every separate page
mm.
that you have that acronym there. So that's yeah, there's something to think about. Um, Acronyms are not. I mean, they're a problem in the sense that if you don't know what your meaning with acronyms, you have to look up what they are and all that sort of stuff. And that could be a problem, but yeah, yeah.
yeah. The last one is robust. And robust basically says all the information that a person can see visually, someone can access it through audio, and it's the same information on a mobile, on an iPad. Doesn't matter which way you access it, everyone has access to the same information. What's your biggest one there?
Yeah, robust is mainly to do with the code that is
Yeah.
used. So it's often very, very difficult to develop for multi-platform or multi-environments because you have to do certain, code for different browsers or for different user interfaces. So often it's very difficult to ensure that you're robust in your system because to do that successfully, you really do need to test for every scenario, and sometimes a lot of it, means a lot of money that needs to go out, and people just don't have the time or the resources to actually test on every device or every interface. So that leads to some problems. So robust is, yeah, it can be achieved by simulation, and that sometimes works, but often it requires actually physically testing things out on different environments and different interfaces. But it also means checking to make sure that your code is validated, so your HTML, your styles, so all the tools that you use for those, they're probably worth using. And yeah, I'll just um, a good robust system will always be a system that will most of the time work because most of the browsers actually are meant to behave the same way. So
Yeah. And
quote
that's it.
unquote.
And the error
Yeah.
that I find in this is lack of feedback when a page is loaded, or say a section in a page is loaded. There'll be visual feedback. There is never an audible
But
version of it.
that's actually an operability component
But it's
because
also
basically,
now in WCAG, it's 4.1.3 is the
right.
actual test, which is
Okay, so
status messages.
yeah. So therefore, you need to make sure that if you're using a web application, for instance, so something that you're pulling data through JavaScript, you need to make sure that you also provide messages to the browser or to the client that says, yeah, getting data, receive data, or finished receiving data, or something like that. Because you shouldn't be relying on the browser to actually do that, because not, so for instance, the best one I was looking at is, we were looking at the US election on Google or Nate, and that was getting refreshed, but I wasn't able to tell uh, except for there's one line on the top there that said updated as the time, and that was quite useful. So yeah, we weren't getting information via the assistive technology. So you do want that, but I think this one's a really good one because it's something that was a bit close to my heart in terms of what uh, we would do if you're doing food delivery type applications. Because you would want to know where your food is being prepared, or whether it's been packed, whether it's been picked up, delivered, etc., etc. So you would want to do that sort of thing in some sort of live region, and yeah, that's where messages like your rich application type messages for ARIA are useful. So I'm a big, but as I said, that's sort of a operability slash robust thing because you've got
Yeah.
that crossover, and I think you'll find a lot of that happens. So yeah,
Yeah. So, Mark, with all of that, what's the takeaway that you can give? We've looked at, and we've only covered a few of the very common errors, and there's so many of them. Titles like uh, too tight, like use of a title and text is another one. So there's just so many little things that can build, and they are common errors that happen in every website. What's a takeaway that you can give?
I think the biggest takeaway still for me is to build accessibility. To put accessibility into the building, designing, and implementation phases of any project. Yeah, I think a lot of web developers need to take that on board. Start to use some sort of software engineering paradigms to do that. It's not that difficult to add accessibility. It's a lot more difficult to add it on afterwards, and it's quite expensive. So that's I, my I probably will die saying that, but anyway, yeah, that's yep, that's pretty much it
Yeah,
at the moment. That hasn't changed.
yeah.
Um,
So,
yeah, yep.
so Mark, how can people reach you if they want to keep chatting to you about it, find out more information?
Well, just look us up on dasat.com.au. And our email address and phone numbers and all that are there. And they can also contact you, Nira. So yeah,
Yeah, they
um,
can. So, yeah, look, if you like what we're doing, thanks, Mark, by the way, for coming on. If you like what we do, please like, share, subscribe, review. Let us know feedback, good, bad, and ugly. We love feedback. And we're not sure what principle we're covering next week, but we've got some amazing people coming up for our podcast show. I'm Narelle, and we'll see you next time. Bye bye.